Okay, guys, this is just a short introductory lecture about historical theories of psychopathology. In the next class, we'll get into more of the specifics and details of contemporary thinking about the causes and treatment of mental illnesses. But before we get there, we're going to start with a little backstory, what your book calls the evolution of contemporary thought. Overall, it's important to remember that once we get into the 19th century, although few people knew what caused mental illnesses, people were more likely to believe in biological or interpersonal and psychological causes of mental illnesses rather than spiritual causes. And this persists today. Biological and interpersonal or psychological causes predominate conceptualizations of mental illnesses. But a lot of what was believed early on about these causes sound a bit preposterous today. Despite that, it's important that we look back on these conceptualizations in order to track the progression over time. Because despite how ludicrous some early conceptualizations might sound, they form the basis for how we think about mental illness today. So let's start with some biological causes of mental disorders. Your book mentioned that the work of Pasteur, who invented germ theory, and also Galton, who is the founding father of genetics, were both instrumental in establishing that there might be some biological causes to mental illnesses. Based on their work, early theories about the biological causes of mental illnesses centered around two key pieces. Either that symptoms of mental illnesses were caused by bacterial or other types of infection, or that symptoms of mental illness were inherited. Now, certainly both of these perspectives were a marked improvement from previous biological theories, such as those that presumed mental illness was caused by the imbalance in the four humors. And these theories have really pushed our understanding of mental illness. Unfortunately, at the time these theories didn't necessarily give us a whole lot of guidance on how we should treat mental illnesses. As a result, particularly in the 19th century, there was a certain feeling of inevitability or even lack of control that accompanied certain types of mental illnesses, almost like once you had it, you couldn't get better. As was often the case, however, biological explanations of mental illnesses weren't able to explain all instances of mental disorders. And so as the 19th century progressed, there was also a simultaneous movement to try and understand alternate causes of mental illnesses. And this way of thinking fell into the psychological or interpersonal category. In part, this was due to one particular cluster of symptoms that grew rampant throughout Europe, which was hysteria. Now, currently, hysteria is understood as a somatization disorder, in which psychological distress is manifest as physical symptoms. However, for a long time, no one knew what it was. All that they knew was that the symptoms, which are almost exclusively observed in women, were incredibly diverse. In fact, a 19th century physician named George Beard actually developed a 75-page list of possible symptoms of hysteria, which he claimed wasn't even complete. Most commonly, though, symptoms were thought to include nervousness, faintness, hallucinations, emotional outbursts, various urges of a sexual variety, insomnia, fluid retention, muscle spasms, shortness of breath, irritability, and a quote-unquote tendency to cause trouble, which we now know means not to conform to societal standards. In the 1950s, it was estimated that at least a quarter of all women suffered from hysteria. And as I mentioned in class the other day, there were a lot of really bizarre theories about what caused these symptoms. There was the classic wandering womb theory. Others theorized that hysteria was caused by the retention of female semen. Don't ask me about that one. And genetics were also presumed to play a role. But as we move later into the 19th century, psychological explanations of hysteria became more common as a result of the work of Mesmer, who admittedly was a bit of a charlatan, but also Charcot, then Joseph Breuer, and Freud. Breuer developed what he called the cathartic method. Essentially, it was hypnosis. He would help the patient get into a very relaxed state, and in that state would then encourage the women to talk about past experiences as well as current issues. And lo and behold, it worked, at least for a lot of people. And because it worked, conceptualizations of hysteria, amongst many other mental disorders, were transformed to be thought of as the physical manifestation of unacknowledged stresses. And from this, psychoanalysis was born, which is what we'll talk about in the next video lecture.